If you think the trade war between the United States and Canada is just about steel and aluminum and potatoes and lumber, then buckle up right now, because what just happened in Ottawa is something that nobody in Washington saw coming, something that defense analysts are calling the first seismic fracture in 70 years of American military dominance over its closest allies, and something that will cost Lockheed Martin, one of the most powerful defense contractors on the planet, billions of dollars if Mark Carney follows through on what his own defense minister just announced. And before we get deeper into this, if you want to understand what is really happening behind the closed doors of the Pentagon and the White House, if you want to know the full story that most outlets are only giving you half of, then hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the bell, because this story is developing by the hour, and you do not want to miss a single update. So here is what you need to understand about the background, because this did not happen overnight, and it did not happen because of one phone call or one tweet. This has been building for over a year, and it starts with a decision that Canada made in 2023 that was supposed to be simple, final, and completely settled. In June of 2023, after 2 decades of delays, false starts, and political controversy, Canada signed a $27.7 billion contract with Lockheed Martin to buy 88 F-35 Lightning II stealth fighter jets to replace the Royal Canadian Air Force's aging CF-18 Hornets, aircraft that have been flying since the 1980s and are so old that replacement parts are increasingly difficult to source. And at the time, everyone assumed the matter was closed, the competition was over. Saab's Gripen had lost, and America's most advanced fighter jet was coming to Canada. But then Donald Trump came back to the White House in January 2025 and decided that Canada was not an ally. It was a target Trump called Canada the 51st state, posted altered maps showing Canada absorbed into the United States, called former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau Governor Trudeau, as if he were a subordinate rather than the elected leader of a sovereign nation, and then hit Canada with 25% tariffs in March of 2025, raised them to 35% by July, and added another 10% in October after a television advertisement featuring Ronald Reagan arguing for free trade ran during the World Series, and Trump got so personally offended that he added another tariff layer, bringing the total on some Canadian goods to 45%. And what did Mark Carney do when he became prime minister after winning a landslide election on a platform built entirely around standing up to Donald Trump? He ordered a review of the F-35 contract, not a cancellation yet, a review, but in the world of $27 billion defense procurement contracts. That word review is not a minor administrative procedure. It is a signal. And Lockheed Martin, the Pentagon, and every defense analyst in Washington understood exactly what it meant. Here is where the story gets extraordinary, because what Carney has done with the F-35 review is not just a military procurement decision. It is the most sophisticated piece of economic leverage any American ally has ever held over Washington, and Carney is using it with the precision of someone who spent 13 years as a central banker negotiating with the most powerful financial institutions on Earth. The numbers tell you everything about why this matters so much to the American defense industry. The F-35 program is the most expensive weapon system in human history, with a total life cycle cost that the Pentagon's own Office of Cost Assessment puts at $1.7 trillion over the life of the program. And Canada's order of 88 jets represents not just the contract value, but decades of maintenance, upgrades, software licensing, spare parts, and sustainment costs that flow directly to Lockheed Martin, Pratt & Whitney, BAE Systems, and hundreds of American defense subcontractors. When Canadian Defense Minister Bill Blair stood up on March 14th and announced publicly that Ottawa was looking at potential alternatives to the F-35, he was not making a casual comment. He was delivering a message from a prime minister who understood that the one thing Washington cannot ignore in a trade war is the threat of losing a defense contract that affects the bottom line of the most powerful lobbying force in the American capital. And the alternative waiting in the wings is not some obscure aircraft that nobody has heard of. It is the Saab JAS-39 Gripen, built in Sweden, a country that just joined NATO, a country that sent its king and queen on a state visit to Canada last November in what defense analysts universally described as a choreographed sales event, and a company whose CEO, Mikael Johansson, has been publicly telling reporters that Canada is examining how to avoid becoming too dependent on the United States. Saab's offer is designed to appeal to exactly the argument Carney has been making since the day he won the election. sovereignty, jobs, and independence from American supply chains, because Saab has promised to build a Gripen assembly line inside Canada, creating 12,600 aerospace manufacturing jobs at home rather than sending that work to Fort Worth, Texas, and partnering with Bombardier, one of Canada's largest industrial companies, to handle production. Lockheed Martin, for its part, claims its F-35 program will bring 150,000 Canadian jobs over the life of the contract, a number 12 times larger than Saab's offer. But Canadian Industry Minister Melanie Joly responded to that claim by saying, and these are her exact words, "We believe that we didn't get enough when it comes to the F-35. The industrial benefits are not enough. There needs to be more jobs created out of the F-35 contract. That's clear to me and clear to this government." And then she said something that should have sent a chill through every Lockheed Martin executive's office. That is why we're looking at the Gripen. So you have the defense minister announcing alternatives are being examined, the industry minister saying the economic benefits are insufficient and pointing at the Gripen, and a prime minister who has spent 12 months methodically reducing Canadian dependence on American economic relationships, 12 new trade deals on 4 continents, a canola agreement with China, an electric vehicle deal that infuriated Washington, a WTO dispute filing against U.S. tariffs, and $22 billion in retaliatory tariffs that took effect this week. Now, here is the part that Washington is genuinely frightened about because it goes beyond the money and into something much more fundamental about American military power. For 70 years, the United States has maintained a near monopoly on the sale of top-tier combat aircraft to its closest allies: Britain, Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark. Countries that could theoretically develop or purchase non-American fighters, but chose not to, partly because of the F-35's genuine technological superiority, and partly because of the strategic logic that operating the same aircraft as the United States creates seamless interoperability in coalition warfare, shared intelligence, shared maintenance infrastructure, shared upgrades. If Canada, America's closest ally, the country that shares the longest undefended border in the world with the United States, the country that has fought shoulder to shoulder with American soldiers in every major conflict since the First World War, if Canada breaks from that 70-year pattern and chooses a Swedish jet over an American one because its relationship with Washington has deteriorated to the point where it no longer trusts American supply chains, the signal that sends to every other American ally watching this situation is seismic, real, clear defense. One of the most respected defense analysis publications in the country described a Canadian switch to the Gripen as the first seismic fracture in a 70-year trade between the United States and those allies who maintained the ability to buy top-line combat aircraft from America. And the word seismic is exactly right, because earthquakes do not stop at the first crack. Australia is watching this. Japan is watching this. South Korea is watching this. And all of them have their own growing discomfort with the unpredictability of American trade and foreign policy under the current administration. But here is where it gets even more dramatic, because the United States has one card left to play, and Washington has already started playing it. And it is the kind of hardball that reveals exactly how much leverage America is willing to throw around even against its closest allies. The F-35 and the Gripen both use a communications and data sharing system called Link 16, the network that allows fighter jets to share targeting data, radar information, and threat warnings with each other and with ground forces in real time. It is the nervous system of modern NATO air combat. And the terminals that enable Link 16 communication, known as MIDS LVT, are a U.S.-controlled technology, co-developed by Raytheon and BAE Systems, and any country that wants to use them needs American permission and American-supplied components. Pete Hoekstra, the U.S. ambassador to Canada, warned publicly on January 26th that the NORAD agreement would need to be changed if Canada bought Gripens, and that the U.S. would have to send its own aircraft into Canadian airspace to cover the gap. And defense journalist David Pugliese, one of Canada's most respected military reporters, wrote that Hoekstra had given Carney all the cover he needed to break from the F-35 by making a threat that sounded more like coercion than alliance management. The irony that cuts through all of this is devastating. Washington is trying to keep Canada in the F-35 program by threatening Canada, the same tactic that pushed Canada toward reviewing the F-35 in the first place. And Mark Carney is a man who does not respond well to threats, who won a national election on the promise of standing firm against exactly this kind of pressure, and who has so far proven that every time Washington threatens Canada, he finds another way to demonstrate that Canada has options. Canada's Royal Canadian Air Force has been clear about its own preference. Former commanders, including ex-Chief of Staff Tom Lawson, signed a letter to Carney warning against the Gripen, saying the F-35 is so far beyond anything the Gripen can provide that anything saved in money would be lost in capability. And Lawson told reporters that a hybrid fleet would be close to useless during wartime. But Carney's government has repeatedly signaled that this decision is not purely a military performance question. It is a sovereignty question, an industrial policy question, and a geopolitical message question. And that is exactly what makes this moment so significant for Americans to understand, because the conversation happening right now in Ottawa is not really about which jet flies faster or which radar is more powerful. It is about whether Canada, after 70 years of deep integration with American defense systems, still trusts the United States enough to remain dependent on American technology, American supply chains, and American goodwill for the aircraft that its pilots will fly into combat. Mark Carney ordered the review of the F-35 contract the same week he was calling the old relationship between Canada and the United States over. And those two statements are not separate policies. They are the same policy expressed in different languages, one diplomatic and one industrial, both saying the same thing to Washington. You cannot bully us with tariffs and sovereignty threats on one hand and expect us to write you a $27 billion check with the other. The decision on the remaining 72 jets has not yet been made, and Lockheed Martin still has time to come back with a better offer. But the fact that Canada's defense minister announced publicly on March 14th that alternatives are being examined, the fact that Industry Minister Joly has said publicly that the current deal does not deliver enough Canadian jobs, and the fact that Saab's CEO is telling international media that Canada is actively working to reduce its dependence on American systems. All of that tells you where this is heading. And every defense contractor in Washington, every Pentagon official watching this story, and every American ally who is quietly taking notes on how Canada has handled this trade war understands exactly what it means when the closest ally you have starts shopping for a different supplier.